morning, and we are now starting a new panel. We will have a discussion, debate, and exchanges around participation of civil society in the UN processes. Today with me, there's Leah Kimber. She's a sociologist and researcher at the University of Geneva. We have Nicoletta Zappile. She's a deputy director of program at UPR Info. And then Nicoletta Dentico, she is head of Global Health Justice Program at SID, Society for International Development, and then also this chair of the G2H2 platform here in Geneva. First of all, I would like you to present a little bit more who you are, more in depth, and also the work that you are doing on human rights as part of your assignment in the University of Geneva, and then also for all the other panelists.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to speak here on this extraordinary day. So my name is Leah Kimber, and I'm a sociologist at the University of Geneva. And my research basically addresses the inclusion of civil society in UN intergovernmental negotiation processes. And I did one of the researches by integrating civil society as civil society part of academia, and trying to understand the mechanisms that do include civil society and the mechanisms that exclude civil society. And I think if we want to have the idea was if we want to have a greater impact as civil society at the UN, we need to understand what the mechanisms are. And so unpacking the different processes and the different ways of finally getting agenda items on a document basically speaks to a whole process. And so that was the basic research. So obviously the research tackles concepts of inclusion, but also diversity. And so it sometimes directly and sometimes indirectly speaks to the Universal Declaration, but yet, I mean, we can still start finding links here, which I think we'll take the time to explore later. Thank you.
And Nicoletta, can you explain more about the work that your organization is doing in relation to the human rights and then the Human Rights Declaration?
Yes, first of all, I would like to thank you for inviting us during this day to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As UPR Info, we are an NGO based in Geneva that was created in 2008 to raise awareness on the potential of the Universal Periodic Review. This is a human rights mechanism that was created to assess the human rights situation in each and every country of the 193 UN member states. Which has different entry points also for civil society organizations to participate in this process. As an organization, as an NGO, we try to provide capacity building activities or technical support to the different actors that can participate in this process. And I like to highlight, as we call it, a process rather than a mechanism, because as I hope we will have the opportunity to see later on, the Universal Periodic Review really can trigger processes at the national level, not only at the international level, on human rights and how to protect and promote human rights. So we support civil society organizations, other civil society actors as national human rights institutions, but we also work with students, members of the academia or journalists, because every actor can actually play an important role in the UPR. And of course, we also provide technical advice to how states that are, let's say, one of the major actors of the UPR, how they can use it at best to protect, promote, and fulfill human rights.
Nicoletta?
Thank you, Veronica. And yes, I start with the words of, how thrilled I am to celebrate this glorious anniversary with the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, and also in the name of Rosa Luxemburg. I think it is a very powerful experience that you allow me to have today. And thank you. Also, thank you for talking about this topic, which is so important. I am now leading the Global Health Justice Program at Society for International Development, which is a very old organization in a way. It was born in the 50s to basically, give substance to the notion of the new economic order that the United Nations set up just a few years before, wanted to establish after those terrible wars, the two genocides, and also two bombs that had dropped on the same country in a week. So it comes through the legacy of what is development and how development should be interpreted. The development, which is a notion today that has become very contested and very controversial. And that's where civil society comes on board. My role, of course, is I started with disarmament issues, and I was very involved in the landmine campaign. And that's how then I shifted to the right to health, and realized that actually right to health, because it encompasses all the other rights, it's the terrain of a war against people that does happen in so many ways, and recent years also including trade rules, financial rules and speculations, simply by the fact that we live in a totally unregulated economy. So this impacts on fundamental rights, the right to health being the first. By the way, I really need to say that the right to health is the first institutionalized and constitutionalized right. It was constitutionalized in entry into force on the 7th of April of 1948, which means, and it became binding, the first binding right before the Declaration of Human Rights. So working in this arena entails a lot of activities, as well as also looking at what is the role of civil society in this field and how civil society has changed. So to represent a little bit what I've been doing in a rather long experience, I've been involved in the Landmines Treaty. Of course, I've been involved in the treaty for the Tobacco Convention, and have seen how, as Leah was saying, civil society's role and positioning has changed across the decades. I hope we can go a little deeper into this. And my work today is, to put it in a bit of a slogan, is also to decolonize civil society. I think we really need to decolonize civil society, just as we need to decolonize multilateralism.
Okay, thanks, Nicoletta. Maybe we can start our reflection a little bit more on really the role of the civil society in the multilateral space, but also by thinking who is civil society, what do we mean by civil society, and then really how they intervene in the UN processes. And maybe, Leah, you can, based also on your research, tell us a little bit more.
Thank you. Yeah, just first things first, clarifying definitions, right? So yeah, when we talk about civil society, there's in academia at least, there's a notion of good doers that comes from when the UN was established, we talked about NGOs, right? So there was always a space for NGOs to be involved in at the UN. And we're not talking about the ILO, that is already a tripartite organization, but talking about the UN. So moving forward, civil society has just exploded and its engagement has really shifted after the fall of the Berlin Wall, where we observe that there's a consciousness growing among citizens of the world, saying, well, if the UN has an impact on us, well, we have a right to speak up, and we have a right to be part and take part in discussions and negotiation processes. And because fundamentally the decisions will come to us. So so civil society really it takes more and more space, and the UN hears that. The UN hears that, and from going from what they call the NGOs, take on the concept of civil society, which has a broader meaning. So already conceptually there's a shift, a first shift there. And at the Earth Summit in Rio, we have a new document that stipulates that civil society can now be engaged beyond just ECOSOC accreditation and be engaged by the major groups. So we have 9 major groups. So if I enumerate them, we already see who has like a channel for expressing themselves. So we have women, we have youth and children, we have farmers, we have indigenous, we have local authorities, we have farmers, and then we have business and industry, which is an interesting one because obviously it speaks to an area of civil society that we should discuss after with Nicoletta, I think. And we have science and technology. Anyway, so the role of civil society from an academic perspective throughout the years has been to sort of be the voice that is not heard from the governments. And again, the idea was the good doers. So it's for the benefit of the good. And so I think most people are still hang on to this concept because we observe, of course, that there are civil societies, that organizations that are maybe going against this trend or with more conservative views. And so the question is, how does this fit into a more broader understanding of what civil society is and what we would expect them to integrate the UN and take position and voice their concerns. So, yeah, sorry.
No, but maybe because Nicoletta was mentioning that, maybe you can also say a little bit more, how do you think that the role of civil society has changed since the 48, when the Human Rights Declaration, in your experience, and what have you seen as a change in the role, in the position, and also how they were able to advance human rights with the presence of other entity that are also like corporate that are also trying to influence and enter in the UN processes.
Thank you, Veronica. Well, of course, 75 years ago, when in a way the UN started moving its first steps, we have to be mindful that the world was much smaller in a way. You know, it was the UN started with a bare handful of countries. It was about 40 countries that actually initiated the whole thing. And we were in a perfect time of colonization. So half or even more than half of the population was indeed not represented, if not through the colonizers. So this creates a completely different scenario. Then at that time, of course, there was the kind of post-war civil society, entities that were looking at the recovery, the reconstructions, you know. And the situation in a way was much simpler in its gravity and in its brutality, but it was so much simpler. Then, of course, the civil society also developed pretty much along the Cold War lines, you know, and then you had the civil societies of the West protecting and defending more the civil and political rights versus those that were actually aligned with an agenda looking at economic, social, and cultural rights. Now, some people are still insisting on this division, which in my view is completely, you know, obsolete, and it doesn't represent the complexity of today's world. But with the fall of the Berlin Wall, as Leah was saying, there has been a mushrooming, an explosion of civil society entities. I must say that I personally, if I have to speak about my experience, I'm very much, you know, experientially, but also emotionally attached to the glorious decade of the post the post-Berlin Wall, the nostalgic year, for two reasons. First, because after that, extraordinary event, the UN set up a series of summits to discuss what now. And because in reality, the kind of peace dividends that Boutros Boutros-Ghali had announced and had declared were taken seriously by certain members of civil society. I mean, I give you an example that I had the total privilege to be part of, the landmine campaign. Banning landmine today seems to be an obvious thing, it's almost a kind, a chivalry in the huge disarmament agenda. But at that time, the idea of banning a conventional weapon that everybody was using, like bullets, was pretty much extraordinary. And it was the first time where people were brought forward to the scene, where the topic was humanized. And actually, even the landmine survivors became a protagonist of this battle. I had the privilege of being in Kabul in 1995, where the war was still going on, but you had people from all different factions advocating for the banning of landmines. So there was an explosion of peace urge, peace demands. And there, at that time, civil society was not in a way enrolled to be there as it is today. You have to have all these stakeholders involved. The civil society simply was there and occupied the spaces and was extremely political and extremely vocal, naming and shaming those that were against it. And there were no kind of solutionisms. We had to ban landmines, full stop, bringing the brutality of the tragedy there. Today, I think civil society is out of control. I mean, it's lost control. There is a proliferation of entities that claim to be civil societies, among them, of course, the corporate sector. And we have all this, the bingos, the pingos, the business interest NGOs, the public interest NGOs, the gongos, you name it. You have a panoply of acronyms that define, because that is a very, civil society, Gramsci would say, is a space. And that space is very strategic because it operates to lobby for certain policies or to contrast certain policies. My problem with civil society today, apart from its completely unregulated explosion, is that the private sector, the corporate sector, in all its variants, because you don't only have the corporate sector proper, you have this animal that has grown enormously during the last couple of decades, which is the philanthrocapitalism, the kind of the social agenda version of the corporate sector, philanthrocapitalism. Well, philanthrocapitalists, we're talking about a bare handful of people. I mean, really, the ones that count are less than 5 people who have pushed for the reform of the UN with the Global Compact. They have intruded the private sector with the idea that they would fund the UN, which they didn't, but they only created the space for them to meet all the people that count, ministers, presidents, and now they are so powerful and they embody such an asymmetry of power that, in fact, they have also, penetrated viciously the civil society sector. They support it financially and the policy making of it. They support the agencies. They pay the UN agencies. In fact, they are, in the case of health, the primary first and second and third and fourth supporter of the World Health Organization. So here, and I close, it's a very important issue, not only of democracy, but also of legitimacy of the operation of the agencies themselves. Because when you are, impose the people, when you're impose the policies, when you're impose the priorities, there are a lot of issues that are to be tackled. And the risk here is that if we lose the sense of a public interest, of a public function at the national and at the international level, we are now talking about the international level, then we are perfectly preparing the ground for what we see today, not only the increment of wars, but also a certain, violent institutional violence that is spreading all over, the coming back of ideologies and ways of treating people and dehumanizing people that, we thought that we had kind of left behind us. So I find the civil society today is extremely weak to tackle these things, but because those that are very political in analyzing these issues, they don't get financed at all, and they don't get supported at all. And so they risk becoming a very, strong, but also disenchanted minority at this stage.
Thank you, Nicoletta. So yes, in this fragmented civil society space, or like scenario, like maybe Nicoletta, you can tell us how UPR is working, how we can channelize and then put together who are the actors, the civil society actors that are contributing to this review, and then how you see this as a mechanism which is relevant for giving voice to civil society and then having influence on policies.
Yes, thanks. So it's interesting because the UPR is relatively new, even if now, let's say it's 15 years that it already exists. And it was created as a reaction of how much the Human Rights Commission before 2006 was becoming politicized and addressing just human rights situation in certain countries or in certain regions. So when this discussion started in 2006, there were consultations among states, experts, academics, civil society organizations to create a mechanism that would treat all the states equally, or at least that all the states would go through the same procedures in the same manner. And so already this is quite a big change, because the UPR allows to have visibility on human rights issues in all the country. And what is also interesting about this mechanism is that, first of all, it has as a key foundation documents, the Universal Human Rights Declaration of Human Rights. So that is one of the key pillars of reference, with the UN Charter, all the conventions and the treaties that the states have ratified up to the moment of their exam. But beyond, and the international humanitarian law, which is also very important as and not need to be forgotten. But beyond these key foundation documents, the review of each state also is based upon the reports of the national actors. So we have the report provided by the government, the report provided by the UN agencies, or that includes also the recommendations and concluding observation of the treaty bodies that have, or special procedures that have recently examined that state. But most importantly, we have the report submitted by civil society organizations. So this is a first way through which civil society can entry in the UN, let's say, space, and provide their perspective, their vision, how human rights are violated, and what are the measures that should be put in place to improve those situations. If we, let's say, try to go on the UPR history trends that we can analyze that are not as, we cannot go back too much because it was created it first started in 2008. But we see already that from the first cycle, which is the period that it takes for all the countries to be reviewed, so it takes approximately 4.5 years to have the whole round of all the states to be reviewed. This is because the review takes place 3 times per year. And every time that there is a working group, a review, we have 14 countries reviewed each time. So 3 times for 14, it takes 4.5 years to have 193 states reviewed. And if we analyze a bit the reports from civil society organizations starting in the first cycle, so 2008, we see that there was approximately 2,000 to 1,500 submissions that grew up to almost 5,000 submissions in the third cycle that has concluded in 2022. So we see that there is a greater participation of civil society. what UPR Info does, our NGO does, is a bit unpacking the procedures of this process to make it more easy and more accessible, not only to the NGOs that are a bit used to work with UN spaces. And if we looked at the recommendations, at the reports, it's true that in the first and the second cycle of the UPR, so in the first years, we had greater attention on civil and political rights issues, or issues linked to women's rights, because those were the NGOs that already were aware of how to participate in the UN space. And slowly, given to awareness raising that has been done by the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, by other UN bodies, in our small UPR Info as well has contributed to that, we try to unpack these procedures so that other NGOs that usually work nationally at the national level, they do a great work, can be included in this process and bring up their issues at an international level. And we see already from the thematics in the last 5-6 years, there is greater attention to rights of indigenous people, different minorities, vulnerable groups. And also what is interesting is that the UPR is showing great flexibility and dynamics, even if we look at the, let's say, the theories of how it works, and we would say, no, it's a very long and heavy mechanism. Once every 4.5 years, all the states are reviewed. It doesn't assess urgent matters. But if we look at the recommendations that are formulated in this forum, and these recommendations are the result of the reports of the state and on civil society organizations, we see that it's already quite a few years that we are talking about the right to a healthy and clean and safe environment. And it was only last year that it was recognized as a human rights. We see that there is attention to all the issues and challenges that are linked to the digital space. And they are now still at the academic, theoretical level, the discussion on whether do we need to have a new convention? Can we use the current conventions to address these issues? And in the UPR, thanks also to civil society that brings up these cases, because they are the ones who are living it. They are the ones who are touched first, and that's are those who see concretely how those challenges have effects on the vulnerable people. They are brought up to the international level. And why that is important? It's important because first you start nourishing the human rights debate, and also because states, once that these recommendations are made by their peers, have the possibility to commit and implement those recommendations. And we see that there is a large level of acceptance of states that want to show to their peers that they are doing something to improve the human rights situation. And although we can argue that these recommendations are not legally binding as the articles in the conventions, they, however, we see have been used by civil society at the national level to leverage policies, to conduct advocacy at the national level, to make their states accountable. Of course, this is a very general discourse that I'm doing, and every context, every country has a complex context that we should consider. But we see that where civil society organizations have the space also at the national level, these recommendations are used to make their authorities, their institutions accountable for those obligations and commitments.
Thanks. We are saying that the civil society is a little bit also divided, and there's many instances that are participating to civil society, but despite being more, civil society denounce a shrinking space, or also exclusion, although, as Nicoletta, you were saying, mechanisms are there from the UN processes, and then kind of state of exception. Maybe you can describe in your maybe more from a academic perspective, Leah, but Nicoletta, maybe from global health arena. Why, and then what are the controversies and the political tension that are like limiting participation in the UN processes?
Thank you very much, Nicoletta. Well, yeah, thank you so much for sharing all this insight, because there was one point where you really addressed something, and you said these groups or these civil society organizations that know how to navigate the UN system. And I think that is one of the crucial elements in understanding, on the one hand, civil society's role, but also how it influences and how it builds up capacity in order to influence outcome documents that are ratified and are sometimes legally binding, but most likely not. But so, which comes back to who is the civil society that we're talking about, and who are whose voice is taking into account. And I think none of us are really have a true answer to that, because it would require going through the nitty-gritty in each country and seeing, for example, in the UPR, who actually writes the documents, who was the person in charge to collect the data. I mean, so we have, but more generally speaking, what we can do is, with hindsight, when we look at the UN, for example, in Geneva, it's easier to say, okay, who is here? And then in that way, say, well, imagine who is not there. So, for example, just very practically speaking, coming to Geneva or to New York requires money, resources, sometimes visas. Depending on what government, during the Trump era, there were problems with visas. So NGO representatives who had wanted to come and voice their concerns could not take their flight. So there's just a very practical point of who gets to be here. Now, once you get to Geneva, if you're not already a resident here, you need to find ways to get to within the perimeter of the Palais, which seems obvious, but if you've never done it, well, you need a badge, you need accreditation, and getting the accreditation, finding your way until you get this badge is another step. So it means, being well versed in this sort of environment. And then so it already gives you an idea of who gets there. So obviously it speaks to the resources you have and the people, of course. And then once you get into, you finally make your way in the perimeter, you've already been to the Palais des Nations. It's huge. So you have to you need to know what room. I mean, I'm saying that it might be funny, but it's not anecdotal. It's fundamental to understanding which door do you open at what time and where to head. And then once you get a seat, where do you sit? And then where's your flag? And when do you take the floor? And when is your right to speak? So all these elements just show you that you need so many skills, and you need so much expertise, and you need your own gatekeeper within this environment to be able to take you by the hand and inform you and tell you and introduce you to the system, which is not self-relevant. And then what I understand and what we can observe is that, civil society might be here. It might be here, and it might be invited for technical workshops, for discussions with civil society, governments and civil society. And what we call in political science, we have this concept of policy arenas, where you have a space to debate and to share ideas. But this is not where the salient issues arise. It's in the decision venues. And when you think about the decision venues and you look who gets the right to speak and open that door, it's never civil society. And if civil society gets in, it's only on the sides and has a right to observe and never take a voice. So when we talk about, its role within the UN, I think unpacking the mechanisms, how subtle it is to go from one step to another, from integrating, going within the perimeters, and then seeing where to sit down and participate or not, is something that needs to be considered. And then we can, of course, talk about, what are the words that you use? You can't, it's just so codified there. You can't just say, oh, I want, there's nothing really, it's something that we need to learn. Terms like women's empowerment or women's leadership. Those are words that maybe are self-speaking for now, but if you're new to the UN, it's something that you need to learn. And so, of course, all these agenda items are fundamentally linked to the bedrock we were talking about before, which is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so in this sense, everything's linked because you need to be well versed in all the steps in order to get your human rights agenda into the UN. Does that, yeah, I think we need some more input from both Nicolettas, because I think yeah, we could have some more practical maybe ideas inside.
Yeah, or maybe like really thinking like, what does it mean shrinking space? Like why there's a shrinking space? Because there's no visa, and then so you cannot be there because the UN or the member state, they are not giving enough space, or because the processes are there but not accessible enough, or because after COVID, things are also has changed in terms of negotiation, dialogue, debates. So what does it mean for you, or because other stakeholders, they were taking the place of civil society, not corporate? Like what's your view?
Well, I think it's all of this actually, and I think Leah was very right. She's very right when highlighting this kind of logistical aspects, because at the end of the day, they define who gets there and who doesn't. And that is not a minor issue. We have seen repeatedly and increasingly, I would say, over the last few years, this visa barrier that is actually created to a lot of people that should be coming from those countries that are gravely interested by the violations of human rights. I'm intellectually kind of starting to think that this global north and global south division is getting old also. And as we know, we have a lot of global north in the south and a lot of global south in the north. So we are, in a way, we have an opportunity here to understand that we are really suffering from the same model, the same paradigm. But of course, there is still a huge diversity between a farmer in Mali and a subsidized farmer in Italy, for example. Or there is a huge difference between a woman who wants to bring her rights from Somalia, from any country, maybe even from Latin America or even from Europe, and those empowered feminists who only talk about breaking the ceiling. Who have there's a huge, variety is also. The civil society is also a variety of entities with different and at times diverging views. Certainly, something that I can say is that the global health arena is suffering particularly from a structural limitation of voice and freedom of voice of the civil society, which is historical. You go to the WTO, you go to FAO, you go to the Human Rights Council, and you realize that delegations, those who are there, are much more numerous, much more diverse in the first place. You do have the peasants, the farmers, you have the indigenous populations. You don't see indigenous populations at the WHO, forget it. You don't see movements at the WHO. But at the WTO and in other fora, civil society can speak in the course of the negotiations or in the course of a debate around a certain given item, agenda item. At the WHO, civil society can only speak at the end, often when the decisions have been made. And yesterday I was talking to an official of the WHO saying how this coming the last is perceived as a rather useless performance, because we come with the decision, and even in member states saying, yeah, but why do we have now to listen to this sequence of statements that are coming when the decision has been made, and also because we have already spent so much at the last moment when we have already done so much talking already. We have 1 minute, 150 words that we can use to tackle very sophisticated topics at times. So that is a place that really suffers a lot. But in a way, at the same time, whereas the substantive space has never expanded, and it is actually shrinking in many areas, the recitative space is expanding. There is a recitative space, recitative diplomacy space, where civil society must be there because they are one of the stakeholders in a multi-stakeholder arena. And of course, there are many voices that do speak. So there are this kind of, there is this tension, it seems a bit of a contradiction in a way. The question associated with the fact that today civil society is, apart from the climate movement, I think, and the feminist movement, all other actions are, broadly speaking, not represented in the streets, in the open air. They are basically fixated in the rooms, where it is important, as you were saying, Leah, to be there, to know how to move around and how to operate within the UN space, and to negotiate an agenda item, to negotiate language, even to negotiate human rights in any given text. But I see two problems here. Human rights as a decorative type of language in isolated agenda items that don't see the interconnection between women's rights and health and climate change and the way that wars are waged. And so if we don't recover that kind of sense of horizontal interconnections across the different arena, I think we can advocate for all the human rights language we want, and we will even get it, but it will be meaningless in a way. And human rights has become a rather kind of contentious agenda too, because, I hear many of my colleagues coming from developing countries or the global south, as you may want to call it, who are actually preferring a people-centered and planet-centered agenda rather than a human rights agenda, because they are also afraid of how human rights have been instrumentalized for geopolitical reasons. So once you have Nicoletta there working and doing all this very important work, I've been involved for the Italian agenda on women's rights, and I know very well how much work there is. But at the same time, the geopolitical use of human rights is also something that we need to consider. So the space is shrinking for those that are speaking in a way, an uncomfortable truth. The space is not so much shrinking for those that are actually, part of the legitimization process. Let's not forget that today we are at a time where civil society entities are de facto created by the private sector. Global Citizen Movement is a case in point. It's a completely new entity, which can bring to the streets thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people. They can organize fantastic concepts for sustainable development. And then you realize that they're funded by the Gates Foundation, the MasterCard Foundations, the Pfizer Foundations, and all those that want these people to be there to advocate for their own social agenda. That is to basically say that we solutionize a little things, but we don't politicize anything, and the status quo is preserved.
Nicoletta, do you have maybe can share some experience of the organization contributing to the UPR? Is there also a consideration that they have shrinking space, or they don't feel enough represented or like influential? Or
yes, no, there are so many inputs from these last two interventions, but I wanted to take a few of them, starting from Leah. Let's start from the UPR is actually during the working group, the debate. It's a debate among states. So the UPR is states talking to other states and making recommendations to their peers. So already but when you see it like this, you say, but then civil society has no leverage at all. But no, because then given the possibility of submitting report, and the report is not just a pure reporting, it's that those reports really inform the other states on what are the key concerns to raise in their recommendations. And then it's not only the reporting, which that is something that shared, let's say, the technically how this report, and this is something on which UPR Info works a lot, really like break down what is the relevant information to put in the reports, how to build the reports, what are the good practices. This is an exercise that we do on a regular basis to enlarge and expand this possibility for others that are not familiar with the UN. But beyond that, there is all the advocacy work that can be conducted by civil society organizations before the review of their country, during, like, from the moment when the review is happening until the state decides what commitments to get, and after. And that was something that UPR Info really strongly encourages civil society to do, this advocacy work, that it's important. We can do it at the international level. Civil society, it's true, they can come to Geneva, but then who is coming? Those that have the funds, those that have better connections. UPR Info, given this thing that civil society could not speak during the state review, we created an event. Usually it happens 2 months before the review of each country, and we send a call for applications for all the NGOs or the civil society organizations of those countries that will be reviewed. And we say, okay, you have the possibility to come to Geneva. You can do advocacy at the UN level here at the international level. We provide them, of course, with guidelines on how to structure a statement, which language for human rights language to use, because as you said, some has never done this type of work, and it's skills. They have to be also trained. Some of them have great experience, and we also like to share peer exchanges. So we give the space to those who already done it to share information with their peers. So we try to have this approach. So some of them come to Geneva, they do directly the advocacy with the diplomats here, but that is not the only way. Advocacy can be done also at the national level. It can be done with the foreign embassies in their country. So we try also to give inputs, to give ideas on how, when it's not possible to travel or to come to Geneva for a series of the reasons that you have exposed, okay, what are other, let's say, ways that your message can pass? How to contact the local embassies, how to create events, even online. And this is something that we saw during the COVID period when nobody could travel. The UPR, they just postponed one session, but then continued. So there was an example on how then civil society came up with innovative or creative ways to make advocacy through the social platforms, running campaigns on #adopt my recommendation, and organizing online conferences, debates. So we try to analyze all the good practices that civil society have been putting in place to share them with their peers, those that are less aware. And this work of advocacy, it's like we always, one of the first definitions of the UPR is an international mechanism for promoting and protecting human rights. But we like to say that it's actually a national mechanism. They have one step in Geneva, very important, of course, but then really it's something that has to be continued at the national level. And regarding the shrinking space, the challenges that human rights defenders face, unfortunately, yes, it's true. We cannot say everybody has the chance to travel, or they do not have the possibility to conduct their work. Talking about human rights in certain countries can bring people to be detained and imprisoned just because they mentioned human rights language in their activities. So that is something that is happening. We are very concerned of this shrinking space. Also there, we try to share some good practices and not to expose those that can be threatened, but to seek partnership with other NGOs outside the country that can bring up their concerns. And so also there, we try to provide some good practices. And also the last point I wanted to comment on was on this interconnection between human rights that I think that those who work in the sector have now acquired or assimilated. But while we were talking in our team we participated in the Human Rights 75th anniversary campaign, and we had to do a pledge. So we were rereading the declaration declaration and we were seeing, okay, we have Article 2, that is the article about saying that all the principles set in the declaration needs to be applied with no discrimination. So we see that when the declaration was created, this foundational document, but was really linked to this non-discrimination principle, and that now we should integrate the intersectional approach to that and read the declaration with those lenses, not going beyond the non-discrimination, but really applying this. And so this is it's not easy, of course, it's very complex, but it's something that we should revamp.
So, yeah.
Well, thank you very much for raising this this question about intersectionality. It's what you were saying, and you nailed it with the concept that obviously is still a buzzword in a way, and that has been sort of translated in UN terms into diversity. But that's the problem, is that it's uncomfortable. You're talking about uncomfortable knowledge. It seems that diversity is uncomfortable because we don't know what to do with it. We can't write it because it's something that should be cross-cutting, and that we in the terms that we use and the laws that we use in order to write text cannot be written as such. And so it's not only, and this is where it's interesting, it's not only the governments, but it's also the words that we use and the apparatus that we have at hand that no longer fits the pressing issues of our time.
Yeah, I think we are 5 minutes more.
Just this question
Yes.
about civil society jargons, I think it's crucial because diversity is something for which we are really scared. I mean, honestly, intersectionality, which is a sexy kind of technical word that most of the world doesn't understand, but it makes us feel kind of, cool and knowledgeable and good, the good doers. So I think we also have civil society, as we are in this shrinking space, in this difficulty, and in this today's crisis of the UN, I mean, honestly, where governments and many would like to see it kind of closed down. I think civil society has also, in order to recover its role, which, I mean, it's an issue internationally, but also nationally, as you were saying. And I think it entails a lot of reviewing and reimagining itself and the way it speaks to society and to whom it wants to speak, because I think societies do need our role very much. And also governments do realize that when civil societies are not there, processes are not functioning the right way. Look at the pandemic treaty negotiation at the World Health Organization. It was initiated top-down for geopolitical reasons. Civil society is out, and now it's kind of in the dumps in a way, because it doesn't know how to get out of itself. So there are many. This is also for all the drama of the moment. It's, I think, a propitious moment. It's a good moment to really self-analyze ourselves as civil society entities, to self-criticize ourselves, because no one is innocent ever, but we are not innocent. We have decided to be co-opted in many cases. We have decided to be performing a role which is basically a legitimization of the status quo. I'm thinking of several civil society entities, that are keenly bureaucratically engaging with all these G20, G7, whatever, that are bodies without no jurisdiction superseding the role of the UN. And we allow this to happen, unfortunately. So there are many contradictions that we have to, put on the table and critically review, because if civil society is to be saved and we want to rescue civil society, we really need to go deeper into the hardware of the limitations and the mistakes we've made in order to recover. We always learn from mistakes. Mistakes are dynamics. Success is maybe static. Let's learn from this dynamism of our mistakes.
Yeah, and also because civil society represent people, and then sometimes that's also one of the limitation. You become civil society, but you do not represent enough or good the people, and then so you are an entity, but you are not representing people. So to finish, maybe you can share your recommendation on what and how civil society could work better to advance the human rights agenda. So what is, a couple of suggestions, thoughts? Yeah. You have the solution.
Yeah, a 30-second solution. Solutionism right there. No, but I think what Nicoletta was saying, yes, just before, being reflexive, I think it's true. I would absolutely share that. In order to continue the work, we first have to understand from where we speak and who we speak and what we're aiming for. And I think before we continue our work, there's no way that, I mean, this is a fundamental moment that where we will have to be questioned and question ourselves. And I think reflexivity is definitely a fundamental question.
And academia can also help in this, because as part of civil society, but also like putting the right words and the good reflection.
Yes, but I think and that's why I'm sensitive to reflexivity, because it speaks to academics. And if we're all in this together, and I think we need to, we talk about freedom of speech and what kind of speech and where, when do we start, when do we stop, who are we, what is our responsibility? And I think all these things, we cannot continue preaching to the choir. We need to first see within ourselves or within our own institutions where we stand, in order to also be coherent and deciding what kind of world we want, basically, simply said.
Yeah, I agree with Leah, and one of the things that we encourage to do is to not working alone, like it's because we work mostly with NGOs, with civil society organizations, and there is this tendency of going ahead, bring our message out there, work on this, and we always say, take the opportunity of the UPR, because we're working on the UPR, to link with other organizations, because the issues that you are bringing up, they for sure they are connected with all the other organizations that you don't know, and seize the opportunity of the UPR to make the connections and bring a common message, because then one let's say issue that can happen is that then there are conflicting messages from civil society, and this raises because there is no dialogue between those that work on human rights issues at the local level. So one of the messages that we usually end our trainings is try to keep on the debate that works together with other organizations. So I think I'll finish like this, because I don't have a very time to go in more detail.
I think you were also mentioning intersectionality,
Yes,
or
yeah.
not working in silos, maybe taking a more global approach to human rights, and then consider also to push for new rights, like as you were saying, that like, it's
evolved, because the human rights law is evolving. It's one of those branches that is very fascinating, because it evolves with the current times, with the new challenges that everybody faces. We would have never thought about digital space issues like concern 10 years ago. We were not aware that it could have had effects or impact on children's rights, on their privacy rights, etc. So yeah.
Nicoletta, your final words?
Yeah, and I borrow from Leah's reflectiveness, moment to strategize, to reflect, to also add, and being in this together, this togetherness, I add another element, I think, which is being bold, a certain courage of daring. I think we have little to lose, if almost nothing to lose, as we are today. And I think the courage of daring means getting out of the comfort zones, and also imagining that for us to be more relevant at the UN, for example, that's where I operate mostly, I think we need to not only stop accepting the projectification of human rights, solutions through projects, new initiatives, these town hall meetings that lead nowhere. It's actually policies that make the difference and policies that have to be shaped. Good practices are important, but 1,000 good practices will not be as good as a one sound good policy. So we need to work to repoliticize the agenda and to work together in this, I think, with the courage of daring, with boldness, thinking that we are in the rooms, but there are others that maybe are doing other things. For example, I'm thinking of strategic litigations. These are ways of mobilizing societies, the media, they create news because we don't create any news. I mean, staying in the room and working for a bit of language on a paragraph of the text of the UN. We need also to be creative in this sense and to think a bit out of the box and above all out of our comfort zones.
Okay, I think we will have to give the space to the next panel, but thank you very much to the three of you, Nicoletta and Leah, and then much more to come. We have started already to think about this problematic, and then we will keep working on that together. Thanks.